This video is dedicated to the memory of those who faced the impossible in the skies over the Pacific. Men like Gregory, Pappy, Boyington, who flew not for glory, but for their brothers in arms. May this story remind us that true courage is born not from the absence of fear, but from the decision to face it. If this story moves you as it moved us, subscribe to the channel and help us keep alive the memory of those who wrote history with blood, sweat, and wings of steel. The early morning haze rolled gently over the Pacific as Gregory, Pappy, Boyington stared out from the deck of his base. His stance was relaxed, almost casual, but beneath the weathered leather jacket and confident posture was a mind already charting the day's flight paths, visualizing enemies, anticipating maneuvers. For the Marine stationed with VMF 214, he was more than just their commanding officer. He was a force of nature, as feared by the Japanese as he was admired by his fellow pilots. At a time when America desperately needed heroes, Boyington rose from the smoke and propeller roar with a style all his own. Born in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho in 1912, Boyington didn't have the clean, polished background that many wartime officers did. His youth was defined by restlessness. He was smart, athletic, but always at odds with authority. At the University of Washington, he wrestled, boxed, and studied aeronautical engineering, sharpening the very skills that would later help him outfly and outthink Japan's best aviators. But the road to the skies of the Pacific was long, winding, and often unforgiving. After graduating, he joined the Marine Corps in the 1930s. He trained intensively and flew biplanes, embracing the mechanics and psychology of air combat with religious devotion. But the peacetime military offered few outlets for Boyington's restless energy. By 1941, disillusioned and facing mounting debts, he left the Marines and joined the American Volunteer Group, the famous Flying Tigers, fighting for China against the Japanese. It was here that Boyington first tasted real combat and where his legendary air skills began to emerge. He flew the rugged Curtiss P-40 Warhawk against Japanese aircraft over Burma and China. His methods were unorthodox, his behavior rebellious, but his success rate undeniable. Though records are debated, it's widely accepted that Boyington scored at least 6 kills during his AVG service. These early victories weren't just about shooting down enemy planes, they were about learning. Boyington studied Japanese tactics, aircraft limitations, and behavioral patterns, storing every lesson in the back of his mind. By the time the U.S. formally entered the war, Boyington returned to the Marines, this time as a seasoned fighter pilot. He was older than most, 31 when he assumed command of VMF 214, but his combat experience and fearless demeanor quickly earned him the nickname Pappy. The squadron itself was no ordinary unit. Nicknamed the Black Sheep, they were a patchwork of misfits, transfers, and untested pilots. Many had disciplinary records, others simply hadn't seen combat. But in Boyington, they found a leader who understood them. And in the chaos of the Pacific, they would make history. The Black Sheep squadron flew the Vought F-4U Corsair, a sleek, gull-wing machine that roared through the skies like a thunderclap. It was fast, powerful, and deadly, especially in the hands of someone like Boyington. From their base in the Solomon Islands, they launched a relentless campaign of air superiority across the skies of Bougainville, Rabaul, and beyond. Boyington didn't lead from behind. He was always in the air, often the first to engage and the last to return. The engagements were fierce, fast, and brutally personal. There were no long-range missile locks or radar-guided weapons. It was pilot versus pilot, relying on vision, instinct, and raw reflexes. Boyington preferred to close in tight on his enemies. He understood the vulnerabilities of the Japanese Zero. Its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks made it a dangerous but fragile opponent. He used boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude to gain speed and surprise, then pulling up hard to avoid counterattack. Every mission was a blur of adrenaline, split-second decisions, and terrifying risk. In one dogfight over Rabaul, Boyington dove into a formation of Zeros despite being outnumbered 4-1. His wingman radioed warnings, but Pappy didn't hesitate. He took out 2 enemy aircraft before the others broke formation and fled. The Black Sheep, inspired by their leader's audacity, followed suit and turned the tide of what could have been a disastrous sortie. Boyington's style was aggressive, sometimes reckless. But it worked. His kill count rose steadily throughout 1943. Every plane shot down added another layer to his legend. He wasn't just killing aircraft, he was dismantling the myth of Japanese invincibility in the sky. His name began appearing in newspapers back home, and for many Americans, he became a symbol of the Pacific fight. But fame brought its own dangers. The Japanese eventually placed a bounty on Boyington's head, $10,000 to any pilot who could bring him down. For Pappy, it was a badge of honor. For his men, it was a chilling reminder of how dangerous their leader's position had become. Still, he flew, refusing to hide behind rank or reputation. By early 1944, Boyington had racked up an astonishing 26 confirmed victories, tying the American record at the time. But it was on January 3, 1944, that his streak came to an abrupt end. On a mission over Rabaul, he led a flight of corsairs into heavily defended airspace. The Japanese were ready. What followed was a chaotic melee of fighters, flak, and fire. Boyington shot down his final confirmed kill that day, but in the ensuing chaos, his plane was struck. Accounts vary, but most agree that he was overwhelmed by enemy fighters and forced to ditch in the ocean. He survived the crash, clung to debris, and was eventually captured by a Japanese submarine. The man who had once terrorized the skies was now a prisoner of war. What followed was nearly 2 years of brutal captivity. Boyington was moved between several prison camps, enduring beatings, starvation, and psychological torment. But even behind bars, he remained defiant. He gave false names to interrogators, refused to cooperate, and helped boost the morale of fellow prisoners with his unbreakable spirit. Back home, he was presumed dead. Newspapers published obituaries, and his squadron mourned his loss. But whispers began to surface, rumors of a high-ranking American pilot being held in Japan. When the war ended in 1945 and POWs were liberated, the truth was confirmed: Pappy Boyington was alive. His return was nothing short of heroic. He was greeted with celebrations, parades, and honors. He received the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross, the nation's highest military decorations. His 26 victories were officially recognized, securing his place among the greatest fighter aces of the war. But the war had taken a toll. He was thinner, scarred, and forever changed by the darkness he had endured. Post-war life was not easy for Boyington. He struggled with alcohol and personal demons, as many veterans did. The transition from warrior to civilian was jarring. Still, he remained a symbol of courage and defiance. He wrote a memoir, Baba Black Sheep, detailing his adventures, misadventures, and the brotherhood he forged in the skies. The book became a bestseller and later inspired a television series, introducing a new generation to the legend of Pappy and his black sheep. Boyington's legacy is more than just a number. His 26 victories represent a fierce chapter in the air war over the Pacific, but they also symbolize something deeper. He embodied the spirit of the unconventional hero, the man who refused to play by the rules, who fought with grit instead of glamour, and who inspired others by being unapologetically human. He proved that even the misfits and the flawed could become giants in the skies. As the years passed, Boyington remained active in the veterans community, often speaking at events, signing books, and mentoring younger pilots. He continued to battle his personal challenges with the same tenacity he showed in the cockpit. In time, he became less of a myth and more of a man, one whose imperfections only made his story more compelling. By the time of his death in 1988, Boyington had long since cemented his place in aviation history. But more than the medals, more than the dogfights and down zeros, it was the bond he formed with his squadron and the lives he changed that defined him. He was the kind of leader who made men believe they could do the impossible, and in the Pacific, many of them did. The story of Pappy Boyington could never be reduced to simple statistics or combat logs. His essence lived in the faces of the men he flew with, in the burning skies above the Solomon Islands, in the camaraderie forged through shared terror and triumph. As the Black Sheep Squadron continued their missions, Boyington's influence remained in every maneuver, every choice to dive instead of run, every instinct honed in those furious months of air combat. The young pilots under his command, some barely in their 20s, were transformed under his leadership. He did not run his unit like a traditional officer. Discipline existed, but not in the strict, rigid form most military structures demanded. Boyington knew that he led warriors, not clerks. He inspired them not with punishments or ranks, but by flying alongside them, by taking the same risks, by proving again and again that the sky belonged to those bold enough to seize it. He was a fierce advocate for his squadron, often clashing with higher command over everything from maintenance requests to mission planning. Many officers saw him as insubordinate or unstable. But his men saw something else. They saw a leader who refused to let bureaucracy cost lives, who would fight for better equipment, better conditions, and better chances at survival. For them, Pappy was more than a commander, he was the soul of the squadron. Boyington's understanding of air combat was nearly instinctual. He studied enemy formations, predicted flight paths, and could spot weaknesses mid-maneuver. He taught his pilots how to exploit the Zero's vulnerabilities. In combat, the Japanese fighters had better turning radius and superior agility at low speeds, but they lacked armor and high-speed dive capability. Boyington's teachings focused on vertical fighting, attacks from above, using the Corsair's superior speed and power to strike and then climb away before the enemy could react. His success in the air wasn't solely due to technical skill. He was fearless, often dangerously so. He pushed the envelope of what was considered survivable. His enemies noticed. Radio intercepts revealed that Japanese pilots were actively hunting Lonesome Boy, a nickname Boyington had earned through his solo attacks. They admired his daring, even as they sought to end it. But no man, no matter how skilled, could defy odds forever. Every dogfight brought a new roll of fate's dice. Flak exploded inches from wings. Fuel ran low. Radios failed. There were missions when planes returned riddled with holes, oil streaming from engines, pilots wounded or worse. Boyington carried the burden of each loss deeply, though he rarely showed it. The mission on January 3, 1944, remains one of the most fateful in Boyington's life. The skies above Rabaul were as dangerous as they came, fortified by layers of anti-aircraft batteries, patrolled by squadrons of experienced Japanese aviators. Boyington volunteered for the mission anyway. His squadron was tasked with escorting bombers, and though the threat level was high, Boyington never hesitated. To him, risk was part of leadership. If the younger pilots were going, he would go first. Shortly after takeoff, the formation climbed through the humid Pacific air. As they approached the target area, Japanese fighters rose to meet them in a chaotic dance of propellers and tracers. The calm, controlled routine of flying dissolved instantly into a nightmare of twisting metal and smoke. Radios crackled. Pilots screamed warnings. Explosions lit the sky like hellfire. Boyington engaged immediately, drawing attention away from the bombers. He fired at 2 Zeros, hitting one and chasing another down. It was his 26th confirmed kill, the last before fate turned against him. Somewhere in the chaos, his Corsair was hit. Witnesses reported seeing him spiraling toward the ocean, black smoke trailing from the fuselage. What happened next was a blur of survival instinct. He bailed out into the cold sea, injured and disoriented. The waters around Rabaul were swarming with enemy patrols, and it wasn't long before a Japanese submarine spotted him. He was pulled aboard, tied, and taken as a prisoner of war. For a man who had always been in control of the skies, it was a moment of brutal reversal. The months that followed were a descent into the harshest conditions imaginable. Boyington was interrogated, beaten, and moved between various POW camps. The Japanese captors, having realized who they held, were both cautious and cruel. They isolated him from other prisoners at times, fearing he might lead resistance efforts. He was underfed, denied medical care, and exposed to constant psychological pressure. But Boyington's spirit did not break. He resisted cooperation at every turn, offering false information, feigning confusion, and refusing to sign statements. He kept his mind sharp through memory exercises, mental flight simulations, and imagined letters home. His fellow prisoners later recalled that Pappy, despite his suffering, often found ways to lift spirits, sharing jokes, encouraging others, and keeping alive the hope of liberation. Meanwhile, back in the United States, he was listed as missing in action. His parents were notified. His squadron grieved. Newspapers published conflicting reports, some believed he was dead, others held on to hope. The Black Sheep continued operations but felt the loss keenly. For many of them, flying without Pappy in the lead was like sailing without a compass. As the war dragged on, whispers emerged of an American pilot being held by the Japanese. These rumors were difficult to confirm, but they gave hope to some in the military intelligence community. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Allied forces began liberating POW camps across the Pacific. And in one of those camps, thin, ragged, and nearly unrecognizable, stood Boyington. His return was met with disbelief and celebration. He had survived where many had not. Reporters swarmed him. Veterans saluted him. He was flown home, met with a hero's welcome, and showered with awards. President Truman himself presented him with the Medal of Honor, and the Navy Cross followed shortly after. Yet, for all the decorations and accolades, Boyington carried invisible wounds. The war had aged him. The captivity had left marks deeper than any enemy bullet. He found himself a celebrity in a country already beginning to move past the war. Civilians didn't understand the silence he kept during certain questions or the faraway look in his eyes. His post-war life became a mix of triumph and struggle. He attempted to reintegrate, taking on various public roles. He wrote his memoir, Baba Black Sheep, with brutal honesty, revealing not just his heroics but his flaws, his drinking, his defiance, his pain. The book resonated with readers. It offered a raw, unfiltered view of war, leadership, and humanity. In 1976, his story was adapted into a television series, fictionalized but inspired by truth, bringing Boyington's legend to a new generation. But the series also simplified him, polishing his edges. The real Pappy was more complex than a scripted version could capture. He was brave, yes, but also impulsive. He was brilliant but prone to rage. He inspired loyalty and sometimes left confusion in his wake. He was, above all, real, an authentic warrior shaped by extraordinary times. Boyington spent his later years speaking at air shows, veterans gatherings, and aviation museums. He never stopped fighting for recognition of his fellow Marines, especially those who hadn't made it home. He made it clear that his own story was never about one man's greatness but about a generation that stood up when the world fell into chaos. He remained humble about his victories. When asked about his 26 kills, he would often deflect with a half-smile and say, "It's not how many you shoot down, it's how many you bring home with you." That was the essence of Boyington, valor wrapped in humility, courage laced with truth. He lived long enough to see his legacy endure. Young pilots learned his name. Military historians debated his tactics. Veterans remembered his leadership. And through every remembrance, one thing was constant: respect. On January 11, 1988, Gregory "Pappy" Boyington passed away in Fresno, California. He was 75 years old. His ashes were later interred at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The man who had once ruled the skies with fire and fury now rested among fellow warriors, his story engraved not just in stone, but in the very soul of Marine Corps aviation. His Corsair, the bent-wing bird of war, remains an icon of his legacy. It flies in museums and air shows, a symbol of the daring spirit of the Black Sheep. And Boyington, whose eyes once scanned the skies for enemy wings, is remembered not for perfection, but for persistence, for rising when others fell, for leading when others doubted, and for flying straight into the heart of danger, again and again. The legacy of Pappy Boyington cannot be fully understood without recognizing the extraordinary relationship he had with his squadron. The Black Sheep weren't merely a military unit, they were a symbol of resilience, of second chances, and of unbreakable brotherhood forged under the most punishing conditions. These were men often overlooked or rejected by other squadrons, pilots deemed too undisciplined or too unconventional. Boyington embraced them all, and under his command, they became one of the most feared and effective fighting groups in the Pacific. He gave them purpose, confidence, and a reason to believe in themselves. They, in turn, gave him loyalty, admiration, and courage in moments when even he felt the weight of war pressing down. Boyington made it clear from the start that he was not above them. He flew the same missions, took the same risks, and drank the same cheap liquor when the night fell heavy. They laughed together, mourned their fallen together, and when it came time to fight, they trusted one another with their lives. Their success was not accidental. From September to December of 1943, VMF 214 recorded over 200 enemy planes destroyed or damaged, numerous ground targets neutralized, and a reputation across the South Pacific that sent shivers through Japanese command. Boyington's own tally continued to rise during this period, each kill the result of calculated aggression and a sixth sense for air combat that few possessed. He didn't just shoot, he anticipated. He understood how enemies reacted, and he adapted mid-fight with astonishing clarity. But success always had a cost. Some missions ended with smoke trailing from a Corsair's engine, a pilot never returning to base, or a name erased from the roster during roll call. Boyington felt each loss deeply. He never forgot the faces of the men he couldn't bring back. The war might have turned him into a legend, but it also turned him into a man carrying the invisible scars of command. He masked it well with bravado and laughter, but those closest to him knew the truth. The Black Sheep Squadron's most defining operations took place around Bougainville and Rabaul, both critical Japanese strongholds in the South Pacific. These were not easy assignments. The terrain was hostile, the enemy well entrenched, and the skies filled with experienced Zero pilots. But Boyington led mission after mission into these hornets' nests, often outnumbered and outgunned, and still brought his men home. It was in these battles that his leadership evolved, not just tactical, but emotional. He knew when to press, when to retreat, and when to stand defiant against overwhelming odds. As word of his achievements spread, so did his fame. He was featured in war bulletins, mentioned in broadcasts, and admired by civilians who only knew him as the daring ace fighting far from home. He received letters, photographs, and even marriage proposals from women inspired by his image in uniform. But Boyington had little time for celebrity. To him, the war was not about becoming a poster child, it was about survival, victory, and the bond he shared with the men around him. When he was shot down and captured in early 1944, the military feared the worst. They believed the Japanese would execute him or at the very least use him for propaganda. Boyington himself braced for that possibility. But fate played a strange hand. The Japanese, recognizing his value as a prisoner, kept him alive. They interrogated him repeatedly, trying to extract information, but he gave them nothing. His silence was both a strategy and a defiance. He knew his role now was to survive long enough to come home. Life as a POW was a different kind of war. There were no dogfights, no engines roaring in his ears, only silence, hunger, and the endless ticking of time. Days passed in misery, nights in fear. The camps were filled with disease, brutality, and the fading hopes of men who hadn't seen freedom in years. Boyington was starved, beaten, and left to rot, but he refused to die. He found strength in the memories of his squadron, in the thought of the Corsair's cockpit, and in the dream that one day, he would fly again. He watched fellow prisoners waste away, saw guards commit acts too cruel to describe, and still managed to maintain a stubborn sense of humor. That humor, dark and biting, was often the only shield he had. He once joked to a fellow POW that when he got out, he'd write a book and make the Japanese infamous, not for their cruelty, but for how bad they were at poker. Humor was his survival mechanism, one final rebellion against despair. When liberation came in 1945, Boyington was a shadow of the man who had soared through the skies 2 years earlier. His body was frail, his face gaunt, but his eyes still held fire. He walked out of that camp not just as a survivor, but as a symbol. America greeted him with open arms. Newspapers ran stories of the hero who had returned from the grave. The President of the United States awarded him the Medal of Honor, a moment that even Boyington found surreal. He accepted it not just for himself but for every man who didn't come back. Despite the celebration, reintegration into civilian life proved harder than any dogfight. The war had defined him. Without it, Boyington felt adrift. He tried different jobs, consulting, writing, even public speaking, but struggled with depression and alcoholism. Fame was a double-edged sword. People expected a flawless hero, but Boyington never pretended to be anything more than a man shaped by chaos. He spoke openly about his flaws, often with biting honesty, and refused to sanitize his experiences. He wrote his autobiography with raw clarity. Baba Black Sheep wasn't just a war story, it was a confession. He wrote about the fear, the mistakes, the drinking, the grief, and the unbearable weight of command. He didn't write to be praised, he wrote so that the world would understand what war really was, beyond the medals and fanfare. His honesty shocked some, inspired others, and helped reshape how America remembered its veterans. The television series based on his memoir, while popular, never captured the true essence of Boyington. The show portrayed him as a charming rogue leading a team of lovable outcasts, but it glossed over the darker truths. Pappy, ever the realist, laughed at the show's dramatizations. He appreciated the attention but never let it rewrite history. He once remarked, "That show made us look like Boy Scouts with wings. We weren't. We were warfighters, and it wasn't pretty." In his later years, Boyington found some peace. He gave lectures at military academies, attended air shows, and spent time with younger Marines who saw him as a living legend. He spoke not just of heroics, but of the costs, the sleepless nights, the lost friends, the memories that refused to fade. He taught them that courage wasn't about never being afraid, it was about acting despite fear. He also spent time with former Black Sheep Squadron members, many of whom went on to successful careers after the war. Reunions were filled with laughter, whiskey, and stories retold 100 times. They celebrated not just their victories, but the fact that they had made it home. For all the differences between them, backgrounds, beliefs, paths taken, they shared something unbreakable. They had trusted each other in the sky, and that bond would never die. When Boyington passed in 1988, it marked the end of an era. But his legacy lived on in every Marine who studied his tactics, every aviator who read his memoir, and every American who understood that heroism came in many forms. He was not a perfect man. He was stubborn, flawed, and at times self-destructive. But he was brave beyond measure, loyal to his corps, and utterly unwilling to let fate define him. His 26 victories in the Pacific remain one of the most impressive records in Marine Corps aviation history. But they're just numbers. The real victory was in his spirit, the way he refused to be broken, the way he lifted those around him, and the way he kept fighting even when there was nothing left to win. The Pacific skies are quiet now, but in the roaring engines of vintage Corsairs at air shows, in the pages of history books, and in the hearts of those who still serve, Gregory "Pappy" Boyington lives on. Not as a myth, but as a man. A leader. A brother. A legend. The memory of Gregory "Pappy" Boyington endured not just in military archives or dusty history books, but in the living memories of those whose lives had been shaped by his presence. Even decades after the war, his influence could still be felt across the U.S. Marine Corps, in aviation circles, and among war historians who debated the tactics and decisions that defined his career. What separated Boyington from other aces wasn't merely the number of enemy aircraft he downed, it was the raw humanity behind each choice he made in combat, and the emotional weight he carried long after the war was over. The post-war world was very different from the one Boyington had left behind when he was shot down in 1944. The United States had emerged victorious, but it was a victory lined with sorrow, trauma, and permanent scars etched into the minds and bodies of thousands of returning servicemen. For Boyington, adjusting to civilian life was a battle without a clear enemy. He had once thrived under pressure, in the cockpit, where decisions were instant and survival was defined in seconds. But back in America, everything slowed down, yet the internal battles raged on. He attempted various careers, from working with airlines to selling his story to television. The military, though always close to his heart, was no longer his home. Though he was respected, even revered, he was also a reminder of the painful past many were trying to forget. Boyington's honesty about the brutal realities of war didn't always fit the narrative of a post-war America eager for heroes without flaws. But that never stopped him from telling the truth as he saw it. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Boyington dealt with bouts of depression and a recurring struggle with alcoholism. These years were not his most visible, but they were among the most defining. He continued to write, to speak when invited, and to share his views with a bluntness that remained unchanged since his war days. He never shied away from discussing his mistakes, his regrets, and his personal failures. In fact, it was this candid approach that made his memoir so compelling, not because he was a perfect example of a soldier, but because he was real, raw, and utterly unfiltered. The success of his book and the later television series brought him back into public awareness, particularly among younger generations who hadn't lived through the war but were fascinated by its stories. He understood that the TV version of his life was romanticized, sometimes comical, but he also recognized its value. It kept the memory of the Black Sheep alive. It inspired viewers to look deeper into the history behind the fiction. And it reminded the public that war heroes weren't all polished and stoic, they could be loud, unpredictable, and gloriously flawed. In his final decades, Boyington was often invited to military events, air shows, and veteran gatherings. He would stand before crowds, not as a caricature or a war relic, but as a man who had faced death dozens of times and lived to talk about it. His speeches were part history lesson, part personal reflection, and part comedy act. He often joked that the best part of getting older was not having to follow orders anymore. Yet beneath the humor, there was always a deep reverence for those who didn't make it home. He spent time reconnecting with former squadron members, some of whom had gone on to live long lives, raise families, and build successful careers. Their bond remained unbreakable. When they gathered, the decades seemed to fall away. They laughed over old memories, honored the lost, and reminded one another that no matter how far time carried them, they were still black sheep. Boyington also made it a personal mission to advocate for the mental and emotional well-being of veterans. He knew better than most what it meant to carry invisible wounds. He encouraged returning soldiers to seek help, to speak out, and to find meaning beyond their service. Though he was never a trained therapist or counselor, his words carried the weight of experience. He had been through the darkness and emerged, not untouched, but undefeated. Even late in life, he remained fiercely independent. He rarely asked for favors, refused to play the part of a wounded war hero, and insisted on living by his own code. His home was modest, cluttered with memorabilia, letters, photos, and a few dusty medals tucked into drawers. Visitors were often surprised by how little he seemed to dwell on his accolades. To him, the greatest honors were the handshakes from Marines, the quiet thanks from former prisoners of war, and the letters from young pilots who had read his story and found the courage to fly. When he passed away on January 11, 1988, at the age of 75, the aviation world mourned. But more than that, it remembered. Obituaries recalled the 26 victories, the Medal of Honor, and the years in captivity, but those who knew him remembered something more. They remembered the fire in his eyes before a mission, the slap on the back before takeoff, and the gravel in his voice when he told them, "You've got what it takes." His ashes were interred in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The ceremony was simple, as he would have preferred. No grand speeches, just the quiet respect of fellow Marines and the sobering notes of taps echoing across the rows of white headstones. Somewhere, a Corsair flew overhead, its engine growling like a ghost from the past, saluting the man who had once turned that machine into a symbol of hope. In the years since, Boyington's legacy has grown even deeper. His name appears in museums, history books, documentaries, and training manuals. His tactics are still studied by aviators. His courage is cited in speeches. And his story serves as a reminder that greatness isn't measured in clean lines or perfect records. It's found in the willingness to stand tall in chaos, to lead with heart, and to face fear with nothing more than instinct and grit. A bronze statue of Boyington stands today at his alma mater, the University of Washington. It took years of effort and debate to make it happen, but eventually, the school recognized the impact of one of its most daring graduates. The inscription doesn't list all 26 victories. It doesn't talk about medals or television shows. It simply honors a man who served, who fought, and who never gave up. Ask any Marine aviator about Pappy Boyington, and you'll likely hear a mix of awe and respect. Some admire his flying skills. Others are drawn to his rebellious streak. But all agree on one thing: he was one of a kind. In a war that demanded conformity and discipline, he broke the mold, and still succeeded. In a world that often sanitizes its heroes, he remained untamed. The legend of Gregory "Pappy" Boyington will always belong to the skies of the Pacific, to the days when propellers roared and brave men soared into combat knowing they might never return. But it also belongs to every pilot who doubts their worth, every soldier who wonders if their flaws make them unworthy of greatness, and every person who dares to lead with honesty instead of perfection. Because in the end, Boyington's 26 victories were not just about the planes he shot down. They were about the lives he saved, the spirits he lifted, and the truth he never stopped telling, that courage isn't born from rules or ranks. It's born from fire, from failure, from the unbreakable will to rise again. And somewhere high above the clouds, Where the Pacific sun still glints off invisible wings, the black sheep fly once more, led, always, by the roar of a corsair and the echo of a voice that once dared to say, "Follow me."